Hey guys, welcome to DataVids. I'll give you a quick intro and we'll get right into the code. So this is a C# application we're going to build that has a ReactJS front end. We're going to use QuillJS, which is an NPM package that will allow us to do rich text. We're going to get that text from the user input and we're going to send it to C# from React. We'll save it and then we'll reload it and send it back to the front end. It'll be a fully functional app in a fairly short video. Welcome to DataVids. Hope you enjoy the class. I look forward to reading your comments. Let's get right into it. Oh, one last thing. We're going to show all the QuillJS, the ReactJS code first. So a lot of this stuff is straight from the examples, but the way that we utilize it in the last 75% of the video is going to be pretty custom. So if you get bored, you can fast forward about 25% of the video to get into the goods if you're already kind of a pro at QuillJS. Well, thanks for watching. Hope you like it. Open up Visual Studio 22. You're going to click Create a New Project, and you're going to look at your templates. You're going to want to pick the ASP.NET Core with React.js. If you don't see it on the left, click up here on Search for Templates, and you can type that in. Go ahead and do Next. Give yourself the project name, path, and go ahead, hit Next, and get that built out. Right click on the solution to rebuild all. I won't include that as part of the video because the first time you do this, it takes like 10 to 15 minutes, at least in my case, just doing that initial pull of all the NPM packages that come by default. So go ahead and fast forward the video to the point where we can build successfully with a default template, doing no coding whatsoever. I'll let you guys do that part. And then, so pause the video and hit Next and rebuild all, and then you can follow along. Okay, it's ready now. Debug, start new instance. Loading up the development server, and we can actually leave this development server running while we're updating the front end. We don't have to keep running it, and that's why I did this here at the start. So I'll go ahead and minimize this here, and our development server is running. As you can see, it looks like any other hello world template. And now let's get started. We'll get rid of all this stuff and we'll put our rich text box right here. We'll have a save button. That'll go to the database. And I think then you'll be at the point where you've learned what you came here to learn. So let's begin. Go on over to your VS Code. And here, we're going to go ahead and install Quill. So terminal, new terminal. In my case, this is running PowerShell. You can change it to something else if you want. We're going to do npm install react-quilljs quill. And what this is this is the React wrapper around QuillJS. So you're still using QuillJS, just got some React components that will help to consume that. I'll fast forward while it downloads all the dependencies. It's probably be faster on your machine. I'm working in a camper, so it's a little slower for me today. In the app file, right before custom CSS, go ahead and import. You see I removed the semicolons. Import the Quill CSS. In their documentation, they're recommending the Snow version. That's just makes it look pretty. I think they have a couple of choices. That's the one we'll use for this demo. Go ahead and save your. Well, let's go to the page where we want to show the rich text editor. In this example, we're going to go to home.js and we're going to remove all the hello world mumbo jumbo. Okay, instead of saying hello world, we're going to say edit your secret text here. And in the paragraph, we'll say begin editing at your leisure. At the top, after we import the React, let's go ahead and import Quill. A quick interlude here before we put in more of the rich text editor code is by default the template that the Visual Studio and Create React app have done for us is the old school style. Let's quickly change this to the functional style. It's just easier to look at, easier to use. So let's go ahead and do function home. And then let's have our props. And then we'll need to, at the end of the file, export this. And let's change render to just return. And put the, we already have return. So we'll just remove render. Sorry about that. There. Hopefully you can tell what I've done here. And we are missing one curly brace. This is how I usually lay my stuff out. And if you want to make sure that we haven't broken it all, you know, we could go ahead and go back to the browser because it automatically refreshes because we never stopped running our server. So the development server is still going. Next piece of quill code be in the home method. Just put in the use quill like that. And now let's put in the quill code. We haven't deviated from the quill documentation yet, and we still have a bit to go before we will, but rest assured, once we start saving this stuff to the back end, you're going to see it. Without any further changes to the app, you should see your rich text editor here. Hello, this is data vids. You should be able to make things bold, underline, bring up the size. And so this is the first part of this project. And now it's time to get this information back to the C# end so we can start saving it to the database. Now before we get to C#, there's actually a couple more pieces of code we can copy from the NPM documentation for react-quill wrapper that's going to help us. So another thing that they give us that we can use is the useEffect method. So you're probably aware useEffect is one of those things that came with the functional components that kind of helped us in when we lost, you know, the component will mount, those type of methods. So this will get called when we first load the component. There's more to useEffect than that, but that's what you need to know for right now is this will get called when it loads the component, and when it unloads, this will get updated. So anyways, effectively, in their example, putting the h1 tag in there, let's just leave it like that because once we load some information from the database, we can stick it in this method here so we can reuse what they've given us. So let's save this and we'll go back to our browser. As you can see, React hook for quill is already in here. So obviously we can put ABC, hit save, go back to the browser, and immediately ABC is there. Okay, cool. So the next thing the documentation gives us, and by the way, I'll be sure to leave a comment where I got this code in case you wanted to paste it in yourself too, this front end code, but this back end code will only be available in the video because that's the part we're going to add on. But anyways, the next example they give us, which I'm going to combine with their previous example, even though that's not how they lay it out in the quill documentation, is this on change, which means we're going to need to open the console to see this stuff. But what we're going to do is we're going to look at the on change that they have, and we're going to say, hey, which of these console logs contains the information that we want to store? Because basically, we want to put in the same HTML here as what we've saved from the previous run of the app, right? Because we're trying to persist whatever they enter into the next time we open the program. So I'm guessing it's going to be this inner HTML. But why don't we go ahead and run this and see how it looks. That's my favorite part about React is this instant feedback that we get. I'm going to hit F12. I'm going to go to the console, and now I'm going to come back here and I'm going to add a Z after hooks. Now the on change was called when I did that Z. So as you can see, here's all the console logs that they put in there. Oh, and this one actually lets me zoom in. How about that? So we've got here two sections that look like it has what we want and an array. So why don't we can either save just this information and then when they load it up it'll lose all their formatting, or we can do one of these bottom two. I'd say we do one of these bottom two, and it is as we suspected. So I'm going to delete all this and I'll keep this console.log here because later on in this tutorial we're going to take this code and we're going to use that to populate data that'll go to the back end. So I think we're done with the documentation. We're on our own now. So let's go ahead and make a button to where I want to save the contents of the quill. So if I go down here to the return, this is what's sent back to the browser, and here's our quill. Let's do it right after that. So let's go ahead and do a input type equal to button with an on click equal to, let's say, save quill HTML. And let's make save quill HTML as a function. So if I come up here at the top, I can make it a function out here, or I can make it a function inside of home like this. Do an arrow function. As you can see, it went yellow because it found it. And we are going to have to get the contents like this. So, and we might put a debugger here if we wanted to step through it, but for now, data to save. Save this real quick. Now I did notice that the quill seems to use absolute positioning when we give it dimensions like that. So we're going to add a few spaces with just line breaks under that. And when we do something like this in React, we always still have to return just one parent component, but you don't have to use a div. You could just use an empty container like this. So let's move that button down, and I'm also adding to the button value just so it has some text. This is just a basic HTML attribute of the input control as value. So we're doing on click save quill HTML, which takes us up here, and I've turned this also into an async method. The only difference from what I had before is I added the keyword async there, and the reason I'm doing that is that way I can use an async fetch, but it's actually not necessary, so you can leave that out if you want. Now it's unlikely that you're going to want to just have a single parameter, that the only thing you're saving is this form, so why don't we set us up for success later when you build onto your app. So we'll build it like this as an object instead of like this just as a string. So data to save, and then let's give that string a name. Let's call it rich text. And that's a property. So we'll have a model that consumes this on our C# end. And we can add other items here later, like username or maybe a title for this rich text if you're not using anything like that. Obviously, we're not covering authentication or anything in this, so I shouldn't have said username, but you get what I'm saying. You can put all kinds of information here to send back from the client to the server. All right, so moving along. Right now, I'm going to call the post. I'm actually going to call the C# right here in this method. A lot of times people might say that it would make more sense to move this into state, and we might put that later in the video if we have time. but basically the on click here, or actually the on change is where we would put it in the quill itself. Down here we would have an on change, and that would update the state, and then from here we would pull from the state. But instead we're letting the quill object handle it all for us, and that's sufficient for this app. Okay, for this next part I'm actually just gonna paste it right in and walk you through it rather than typing it out. I think this will be easier. So I'm using await because I made it an async method. Fetch is what everyone does nowadays in React to get to a backend. If you hit F12, you can get to the definition details in the TypeScript file, even though we're using JavaScript. That's okay. The URL that we're going to hit, this is the controller name, and then on the right, save text is going to be the action name, and you're going to need to specify that. I'm going to show you a couple things with that here in a minute. But moving on, we'll come right back to that in a second. It's post, not as opposed to a get or a put. There's some other verbs like delete that are sometimes used, but post and get are the most common. It's a post because we're inserting a new record. If we were updating a record, we'd use put. If we were retrieving data, we'd use get. The headers, this is obviously going to be a REST API that uses JSON. The body, we are putting the information that we're uploading from the rich text editor in the body of the HTTPS request or HTTP request. And then, because it's a promise, you might want to look up JavaScript promises if you haven't already learned about those. With a promise, you're allowed to do .then, which basically says call this callback method as soon as this asynchronous fetch has completed. So you can continue doing other code elsewhere in the application, but then you come back immediately and run this then part of the promise once the request has finished and come back from the server. So in there you can, maybe you'd update some state variable, maybe you'd update a label on the screen saying that we've saved it if the contents of this response is favorable. And we defined it here, and then we use it here. All right. Now remember I said I'd take you back here. So you're going to copy this this partial URL here. You could use a full URL, but then it might flag you for CORS or origin issues, security issues. So I just like to use the partial URL here. And then because this is the .NET 6 Visual Studio template, everything is going through this setup proxy.js down here that came with your template. And you're going to need to add it here. As you can see, the weather forecast is the one that the default template came with. You can delete that. Obviously, you're probably not using it. But make sure you add all your new requests in here. And this template is going to take care of that for you using this create proxy middleware. You don't need to really get into the weeds of that, but essentially, the routes are separated on your back end and your front end, and the template takes care of it for you. If you forget to put it in here, it is not going to work. It will probably give you a 400 error, I believe, maybe a 404. All right. Well, now let's jump over to C#. And you're going to create a new controller. So under the controllers, you're going to right click, add new class, and you're going to call it rich text controller. In rich text controller, it doesn't matter what the namespace is, but I like to keep it the same for all. In rich text controller, you're going to want to make sure you have these two attributes, API controller and the route. If anything doesn't show up green, it should show up green. Just click on it, hold down control, and tap the period button. I call that control dot. Then it'll present you your using choices. You don't have to remember them like in the old days. Make sure you're inheriting from controller base. I've got a test in here. You don't need that. Here's the one you need. HTTP post, save text. you could actually specify something else here if the route that you put in your JavaScript doesn't match the method name in C#. It's really not necessary to do that if they don't match. I just figured I'd put that there to show you. Create a model called data to save. That's just a C# class model, right? And in here, you can put your rich text as well as any other properties that you want to send from your front end. In my case, I just put a public string rich text, and I use the same name here, but with a lowercase d. And now it's time for us to save this information to the database. But let's make sure it works first. There's one more thing I need to tell you before we continue coding here, and that is that when you make changes to this file, the setup proxy, adding your routes in here, um, obviously those routes are different from your app routes, which are pages that you view in React. Your setup proxy routes are API routes to reach the backend. And when you make changes to these, you need to stop and start the development server. Visual Studio is doing npm start for you if you're launching it with F5 from Visual Studio. So you need to do some research if your npm server is not stopping for you. For me, it seems to stop if I hit, stop and restart the app in Visual Studio. But I have heard of this where it doesn't work for you and you have to look in your processes and kill it in Windows. Hopefully that's not happening to you. But if you can't reach this, and just set a breakpoint here, and if you have the code that I showed you, you should be able to reach it. If you can't, that could be what your problem is. But hopefully you don't run into that. Let me know if you can't get past such a thing, and I'll certainly help you out. All right. Well, let's go ahead now and build out the actual saving. So we're going to need either a database or a flat file or whatever that you want to write this to. Now, most of my examples are using databases, so it wouldn't hurt to add some database logic here. But why don't we change it up, do something different, and save it to a file? If you want to learn how to read and write from a database, I'd say probably 60% of my videos on my channel as of today deal with that. So you might want to pause this one and go watch one of those videos and then come back here afterward if that's what you're trying to do. So let's save this to a file. And I did make one mistake, so before we write the save to file code, I need to come back here and show you this. I always make just one mistake per video. This is the one I made this time. I forgot to put the json.stringify around our rich text object. Okay, so wrap that around there. Let's go back and wrap this up. So what you're going to want inside your save text method is going to be all your saving code. Now, traditionally, you're going to want to wrap this stuff in, try catch, be able to report errors back to the front end, but we're keeping it simple for right now. So give it a path somewhere on your computer. I'm not specifying C drive or anything like that. I'm going to have it just write to a folder that I know that Visual Studio has permissions to write to. If you have this hosted in IIS, you can set permissions on whatever user is running the application pool in IIS that your C# web app is running as. And then you can assign folder rights to any folder on your computer or your network that you want. But for me, I'm not specifying a path, so it's going to put it in the same file as my project. Okay, the next line, I use system.io because if I just wrote file, it's actually going to think I mean the file from file content result, which is one of those maybe it's from here, I'm not sure, but it's not the right file. So if I specify system.io, I know it's going to pick the correct file class, which is a typical read-write IO .NET library that we use for everything. I'm using write all text with the path and string.empty. This entire line, what it's for is that if this file already exists, we are going to clean out the contents of it with just string.empty. So we're basically deleting the contents of the file if it already exists. That way, this next line, stream writer, is going to open a empty text file and not one that already has content in it. Then we'll write the contents of our uh, model here. Remember, in the model we have the rich text, and that's what we populated in the front end. So we're going to write the contents of our rich text to that file, and then we'll close the file. Typically, we would use a using statement, but I think .NET 6 is taking care of that for us. But if you're not sure, you could always do using StreamWriter SW like this. And why don't we give this a try? So I'm going to come back. I've already started running it. So we'll come back to our browser. And let's say, hello, my name is, and let's make name is larger or smaller, since we'll make everything smaller. Apparently, I forgot it works that way. We'll make name is bold. How about that? Bold, italic, underline. And let's save it. It looks like it hit the breakpoint. Excellent. F10, F10, F10. Good. Now let's go to the text file, which is going to be in your project folder right here. In the same folder as your CSPROJ if you did it the same as me. And there you go. It's HTML for hello, my name is, inside quotes. So the next thing we need to do is when we start up the app to load the contents of the file so that it already shows what was there before. Now, since it's coming in as HTML anyways, why don't we put it down here below the text editor and put it in here as well. So in other words, we'll put it in here in editable format, and we can put it out here as a label. And this is just kind of a fun app anyways. There's lots of ways we could do this. Let's go ahead and create a get. This time we'll start at the back end and work our way to the front end. We'll create a get that retrieves the information from the file. Then we will create the fetch in the front end to hit that get. Let's go ahead and stop. I'm just put it in the same place. We'll just do. What was that? We'll do HTTP get. We'll do public data to save. We can just reuse that model. Get text. And get has the same parameters that post has. You can specify the route if it's different from the method name, but it's not necessary. Now you might have a parameter in here like an ID if it had multiple. If you had one for each user account, if you're doing user accounts, or if you had multiple files to get, but in our case we don't need that. So we'll go new, or let's do var result equal to new data to save. And then we're going to populate these values, and then we'll return that result. Semicolon there, and you're going to hit Control Space, and there's rich text. Just press enter. But we got to give it what data to return, right? So come up here, and this is the code you're going to add. So what we're going to need here is initialize a string. We'll call it rich text with lowercase r, since uppercase r is our property. Initialize it to string.empty. That's the same thing as, two of these guys. Now we're going to open a stream reader with the exact same file name, same path that you did up here. So you might want to move it into a constant somewhere, or even put it in your app.config file, just in case that path might change. But again, we're making a simple app, right? So now we're going to do readline to get the first line, and to be honest, this thing really only saves one line, even though it has multiple lines. It just uses like HTML to break it into multiple lines, like paragraph tags and h1 tags, div tags, etc. But just in case you might want to load some HTML that you got off the internet into your box, which is one of the reasons I made it a flat file, right? So let's say I did file save on Google and I wanted to load the contents of that into mine just to for fun. then you might want to have multiple lines. So I put this while loop here, which you don't need, but you could have, and just keep adding those additional lines into your result. The next line down here, we started rich text property. We'll put that equal to rich text value from up here. And we return the result. Now we've got to update our front end. So right above your save, and we're actually going to move the use effect above these. Use effect should be above these just because it happens when it first loads, but that's just a preference. Let's clean this up a bit. So right above save HTML, let's put a get quill HTML, and you'll notice that it's almost identical to save. The only difference is we've got get text instead of save text. We've got get instead of post. There is no body specified after the headers. We're not sending information to be updated or inserted. We're just retrieving information. And that's the only differences. So you might want to start by copy and pasting, removing this data to save, and removing the body, changing the post to get, and changing the target. So that's here. We haven't actually called this method, but we're not going to forget because Visual Studio Code hasn't brightened it for us, so we know it's not called yet. So before we do forget something very important, copy that controller and action name and go over to setup proxy, and just like before, you need to paste that in your list of context that your API routes here labeled context. Okay. All right, now let's call this. So first things first, we're moving use effect to where it belongs, which is right after your state. We're not really using any state. We'll just put it right after this use quill. All our use hooks should be up here at the top. So right now, it's pasting the HTML into the quill with some static text, and we want to replace that with the contents of this. Use effect is not async, so we can't call an async method. The recommended solution to that is actually not what you might think. Is to take the entire async method, or a wrapper that calls it, and put that inside the use effect, so it does have scope here, and then call it from in here. So then you could do just call it here in use effect. Notice that I'm not using await. You can't use that inside of use effect, but you can call that method. Now, what we want to do next is we're going to do process this result here, and we will await the JSON for that. So instead of r.json, we can actually just simplify it. So being that I'm going to have to await it anyway, I'm going to just simplify this entire thing and actually assign a left-hand side let response equal to. Since it's a fetch and it's a get, we were going to have to do that anyways. And all this that we copied from here, it would have worked like that. But being that it's in the use effect and that we're making it async, I think it was just getting too complicated. So you can still use that elsewhere in other programs. Good that you learned it. But we're going to simplify it like this. And we will just have the response there. And the default is get, not post, so we didn't need the method. The default is JSON as well, so we didn't need to specify that. And we do need to handle this in a then, but instead of doing it with r.json, we are just doing response.json where response was on the left-hand side. So hopefully I didn't confuse you guys by going backwards, but I didn't want to cut that part out of the video because I felt like that code was still valid and you might want to use it elsewhere. So the next thing I think we should do here is we're obviously going to call this in a then statement, but we might want to set a debugger here to see what it looks like first. I started my development server, and any second now it should pop open. Here it goes. Always want to hit F12 to keep your developer tab open, and boom, there we go. We hit our debugger. Excellent. If you don't press F12 the moment the browser opens, then you're not going to catch that use effect method, which will get you down to this debugger. All right, so if I hover over response, actually it shows it right here, or you can go to console and type response. It shows the rich text has the text that we had entered earlier. So what I really wanted to do is I wanted to see exactly what I needed to put into this clipboard here. So I think what we need to do is we need to put response.richText. Well, let's check. Response.richText. As you can see, that is it, but with quotes on it. I'm not sure if we need to strip those quotes off or not, but let's give it a shot. So I can unpause this, go back to the code, and in here, lost my place here. Here, right where the debugger was, we're going to call, we're actually going to put this entire block. So I did a Control X, Control V there, and we'll take this out with Control X, and we don't need to console.log it. What we need to do is we need to put it in here, and I'm pretty sure we got to strip those quotes off it. The question is, do we want to strip them off when we save it or when we retrieve it? It doesn't really matter. And again, this is right here. I'm going to remove this line, but this right here would be the line text on change if you wanted to store this stuff in a React state. But for now, let's just go ahead and remove that to keep it minimal code. Okay, now we can really see what we're looking at. And we'll run it, and then we'll deal with those quotes. Make sure you've saved. Oh, it's already added them in. Okay. So let's deal with those quotes now. This one has the quotes. What we're going to do is substring. So response.richText.substring 1. So, 0 base. So 1 is the second character in there. And then we'll do response.richText.length -1. Excuse me. And that should take care of that. Instead of saying response, let's do const for constant variable, constant, not a changeable one like let, and we'll do the parsed response, for lack of a smarter word. And then in here we'll do parsed response. And I think that should do it, guys. Let's take a look. Bingo. All right, now to test if we're done, let's do something that we might actually use. And I didn't do any of the code for attaching images, just so you know. So, I know there are some ways to do it, but I haven't written the code for that in this app yet. If you're interested, let me know. It could be a follow-up one. Hello, my name is John Michael Montgomery. And maybe we'll make this one underlined. Okay. And let's save the text. Now let's close the app, stop the app entirely, come back another day, hit F5, and we'll run it again and see if it loads it up. Of course, another thing you could do is you could, once you load it up, you could delete the text out, put something else there, not save it, and then relaunch it if you're really trying to test it. But as you could see, it loaded it back up. But say I did that, I don't hit save, and then I hit F5 or something, refresh the page. It came back from the file. So it's saving it to the file, it's loading it from the file. So this is a fully functional working application. I could go take some stuff off the internet and put it in the file, or I could write HTML outside of this app and it will load in this app. Well, that's all I've got for you today. Thanks for bearing with it to the end. I hope you learned something. I look forward to reading the comments, and class dismissed.